Hello, this is Julia Wahl in her podcast How to Live, and today I will have the pleasure being in conversation with Wendy Wood, Dr. Wendy Wood, who has many years of experience working in mental health in England, in the UK, and the rest of the world. Wendy worked as a mental health nurse, working in both hospital and community settings, including elderly care, day hospital rehabilitation settings, and many other places. She then moved on to work as an assistant psychologist, developing counseling in primary care. Later, because as you can hear, Wendy has been working extensively in many various settings. She then moved into an academic role, developing a wide range of academic programs for over 20 years. Including developing courses in compassion-focused therapy. Is that all correct, Wendy?
It is, yes. Thank you, Julia.
So, anything else we should know about you, Wendy? Any recent activities or interests that you'd like to tell us about?
Yes, I am still actively involved in training in compassion-focused therapy. We do have a diploma in compassion-focused therapy. And also, I'm very much engaged in compassion in schools research at the moment. So that's taking a lot of my imagination and attention. And that's mainly in the UK at the moment that we're looking at compassion in schools. So that's basically where I'm at the moment.
So why compassion personally? If you don't mind me asking such a personal question, how did it all start?
Well, I suppose it was several years ago now, about 20 years ago. And I started to read around compassion, and I got to know Professor Paul Gilbert because he was at Derby at University too, as well as myself. And so I went to a talk of his, and it suddenly occurred to me how valuable compassion was and how much it was kind of missing, perhaps from my life as well as of people around me. And so I found it quite transformational, really, just to understand that concept of compassion and what that meant within Paul's model, of course. So it really created a whole journey personally and professionally for me. And in fact, that was the kind of title of my PhD thesis, was about the personal and professional experience of using compassion-focused therapy. So it was a kind of a long, and still is, a long journey really that had profound impact, I think, for me.
And professionally, why compassion?
I think that over the years, as you said in my introduction, I have worked with different models of psychotherapy over those years. So I began my life as a person-centered therapist, so very much from the Carl Rogers school, which was really important and still is important to me. Then I did an integrative model, which was integrating person-centered attachment theory and CBT. So from that, it was really important to hold the client central to the whole perspective, to understand how attachment influences our behaviour and our thinking, and using a lot of the strategies that are used in CBT. So that was quite a good integration, I thought. But then when I became aware of compassion-focused therapy, I suddenly realised that I hadn't really taken into account evolutionary theory and why we do what we do. And I also hadn't really understood how neuroscience plays an important part in making sense of why we behave the way we do or think the way we do. So it's like that final integration of CFT, which also includes all of those theories that I've just spoken about, seemed to really make a big difference to how I made sense of things with my clients and how they made sense of what was happening to them. So so it did feel like the kind of missing link, as it were, in my approach. And it was quite transformational, really, in terms of the impact it had on my clients and supervisees.
So, where is CFT most useful? Which areas? With whom? So, any specific population? So, what does both your practice and research tell you about this?
Okay, so that's an interesting question, really, in many ways. I think to begin with, if I think about it from an outcome set of studies, then which is traditional in our understanding of science and knowledge, people at the moment seem to be more concerned with outcome studies, random control trials, and those sort of things. And I guess, if we're going to survive in a world that says, you need to look at outcomes, then we need those outcomes. So CFT is relatively young in terms of outcome studies. However, there are emerging studies coming through all the time. And one of the main people that's been really helpful, or main peoples that have been helpful in this, are colleagues of mine, actually, at the Compassionate Mind Foundation. So Jaska and Bazran, Joanne Raven and Tarmigan Plowright wrote a chapter about this in the Gilbert and Simos book 2022. And they did a review of the outcome studies of various settings. And they found at that time, in 2022, this was for UK English only studies. They didn't take into account studies in other languages or other countries. So they found 129 studies of clinical and non-clinical settings. Right. And they found various studies that were saying CFT shows real impact, real potential. So the list went through depression, anxiety, as well as diagnostic groups, physical health and pain, eating disorders, trauma and violence, psychosis and schizophrenia, psychopathy, personality disorder, substance abuse, acquired brain injury, dementia. And those were the sort of clinical populations that they picked up. And then in the non-clinical interventions, there is, of course, Compassion in Schools for Teachers and Children, which I've been privileged to be part of. Compassionate leadership is becoming more to the fore. Training and practices for therapists and healthcare professionals, and training for perinatal women intending to become pregnant was an interesting set. So I suppose there's a broad range of
Applications.
and it's quite young. But I suppose the rider I'd give to that is that depends on us viewing things from a diagnostic perspective, which I think is our general habit in the West, is to view everything from is it good for this? Is it good for that? Whereas I think the general inclination for CFT is to move beyond diagnostic categories. But as I said, the difficulties with that is that we live in a world that expects us to make sense of things in terms of diagnostic categories, because that's the dominant discourse.
So rather than taking into account all these different labels, looking at the behaviors, which would be different. Is that what you're saying? Or
Not so much. Not so much the behaviours per se. I think it's more about the position that we take with people that are struggling in one way or another, and separating them out as if they are disordered perhaps is not the best way. The model itself is really focusing on, we all just find ourselves here with the mind and body that we didn't ask for, that we just have to deal with, and we all experience a distress in some form or another at some point in our lives. So to separate people out into, you're disordered because you have this particular thinking pattern or this particular physical difficulty, in a sense, is kind of blaming the person themselves and saying, it's up to you to get it fixed, if you like. It's your responsibility to get it fixed. So, though I always have a problem with that, I always have had a problem with that, in terms of thinking about it from a very individualistic perspective and saying, well, this is the problem, rather than saying this is a difficulty that we all encounter in some form or another. How we encounter it is idiosyncratic, of course, because it depends on many things, as the model says itself. It depends on our upbringing, it depends on our genetic inheritance, it depends on our environmental perspective and where we find ourselves, and how that impacts on our physiology and our neurology. But the sort of discrete categories of disorder, I think, are unhelpful, really.
So it would be about the shaming and
Yeah,
understanding.
yeah, and that's how I see it, is saying that it isn't about there's something wrong with you. It's more about what's happened to you.
So contextual thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, from my point of view. And that gives us a much broader understanding of what it is to be human.
So a similar question I asked Paul Gilbert as well. So how do you see the future of CFT? So the therapy, the model itself, its next stages of development, maybe its further applications, but maybe the community as well. So maybe two different questions here.
Right. So in terms of the future, I think, well, I suppose it's probably a wish list from me, really, is that what I have enjoyed about being part of the I say CFT, the compassion community in general, not just CFT, is actually being able to integrate other sciences, other understandings, to have a real good integration. One of the things that I agree with Paul about is that to date, a lot of the sciences have kind of separated themselves out. So we have, different science of neuroscience, a different science of psychotherapy, a different science of evolutionary theory, and the like. So to find a way to integrate those, to learn from each other, to broaden out our understanding, is so valuable. So, for example, one of the insights that I gained much from was, anthropology and those sort of understandings about how did we emerge as human beings, and what difference does that make to us now? So unless you have those general conversations across different types and schools of science and bring them together, integrate them all, then we miss huge chunks of what it means to be human. So I think that the future, I hope, would be about continuing that process of finding ways to have those conversations. And in fact, this is I probably what you're doing, Julia, with your podcast, is you're talking to different people from different orientations, different scientific perspectives, and from that saying, there's much we can learn from each other. So that's the one thing, I think. And the other thing is, as I was talking about earlier on, is about maybe a move towards more process or an understanding of research, not just outcomes. Yeah, outcomes are important. I'm not saying that we should
We're not dismissing
stop
that.
those. No, because we do need to know what we do works. There's no point in to be like giving somebody some medication and saying we don't know whether it works or whether it's got any side effects or anything, but just take it. You wouldn't do that. Ethically, but also the process, which CFT is very much a process therapy. So making sense of what actually happens. How do people experience CFT? What makes it helpful for them? And then in that way, we can move to a point of sort of from a nomothetic to an ideographic perspective to help people to make sense of what works for them. And also that doesn't necessarily mean having one-to-one therapy. That might mean having compassion-informed communities, as we've seen with some of the models from the States. I think that's very important. So again, have a much wider paradigm about and discussions about what compassion can bring to communities, to countries even, and between countries. So I think there's a lot of things that have potential to happen, but it does really mean expanding our thinking and expanding our networks, expanding our minds further to be able to take on these things in a conducive environment, really compassionate environment itself. So and I think recently I was reading Stephen Hoffman and Stephen Hayes's paper. They were looking at the future of intervention science, process-based therapy, and I'd agree with them. So bridging differences and between different approaches and different cultures, for example, is really valuable, and that's where I'd like to see things move towards. Sorry, that was kind of a long explanation then.
A question I often ask, but I think it is important. So what needs to be changed in terms of our thinking about therapy or actually doing therapy? So what are your main concerns, Wendy?
I think...
Or hopes, both.
I think, in terms of my concerns, it probably relates to what I was talking about earlier, is if we get too hooked into only observing the person within a very narrow context, rather than seeing people and helping them to see themselves as part of a sort of integrated system. So trying to help each other make sense of things at different levels of awareness. So, and then once you have that understanding, then it enables us to sort of make sense of the world as we see it from our particular point of view. So, being able to understand how we relate to ourselves
Mm.
and the impact that that has on our physiology and our neurology. Then seeing that in terms of how we relate to ourselves means it influences how we relate to others. From a kind of very specific point of view, so from families, friends, colleagues, that kind of thing. And then expanding that out and saying, how does that then influence how we relate to the wider context, so the community, the country, how do we influence it politically, environmentally? So it's an ever-expanding understanding. And all of those different layers of understanding are sort of semi-permeable. So, you know, the different things that happen in society influence you at an individual level, at a physiological level. You know, when you suddenly have that response of shock when you hear about something dreadful that's happened in part of the world, and you have that real sort of gut reaction. And sometimes that sense of disempowerment or helplessness, thinking, what can I do? You know, when these tragedies happen in the world, you know, and being able to sort of tolerate that rather than switch off from it, you know, because, you know, the natural inclination would be so, oh, I can't do anything about it, you know, I just feel quite overwhelmed and I'll just turn it off, which means that, you know, then we disconnect. We disconnect from the world and from each other when we do that. But it's understandable. So I guess that's generally sort of thinking about helping people to go to beyond their kind of understanding of their world, to gradually expanding their horizons. You know, I'm not saying that everybody can do that, but you know, a lot of people, I think, would want to do that.
So it's no longer about this individual or even individualistic type of therapy. It's looking at things in their context, our experiences, and as you were giving your answer to the question about what needs to be changed in terms of our thinking and actually also doing therapy, I thought of yet another question. So, is there such a thing as a neutral therapy or therapist?
No, I don't think so. Because we're all influenced by the same things, you know, by our own cultural background, by our own history, our own physiology. But I suppose the aim would be to make sense of that in ourselves as therapists, to say, well, why am I understanding this client or this group in this way? So it's having that awareness and that mindfulness to be able to say, oh, just a minute, how is that helpful or not? But I don't think it's possible to be neutral because, as I say, you know, we're all influenced by the same aspects of being in the world, you know, and you can't prevent that from happening. So you have to work with it.
So therapy being more concerned with the world, not only itself, let's say, or with the individual in the therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I'm not saying that we should move away from individual therapy either, because that might make it sound as though I'm saying, well, you know, we shouldn't be seeing people individually. Of course, there is always space for having a very specific relationship on a one-to-one basis with somebody. And of course, we know the evidence suggests that we've done that for as long as mankind has been on the planet. There's always been those special people that have been the soothsayers or the shaman or people like that, that have a trusting relationship where You can talk to them when it's not possible to talk to other members of a community. So I think that will always be there. I think that's part of human nature, is to need to connect with somebody sometimes when making sense of the difficulties that you have aren't possible within the existing community for whatever reason. So I think that will always be part of our world, and always has been. But the position we take on that is, as you were saying earlier on, to see it in context, to see it in a wider context, rather than a very individualistic one.
So in terms of CFT itself, what are the main misconceptions or misunderstandings? So in your opinion, what are the main ones?
I think the main ones tend to be, because there's such a lot of overlap between different models of compassion, then it's understandable that they tend to get into a bit of a mix, a bit of a mush. And I suppose, to me, there is this confusion between thinking that CFT is purely about compassion for self and being kind to yourself and those kind of things, which, of course, that's an important part, but it's not the only part, It is about having that understanding of the flow of compassion, which means thinking about how we have compassion for ourselves, but also how we receive or can't receive compassion from others, and how we give compassion to others, or find it difficult in certain circumstances. So the flow of compassion, I think, is a valuable, an important thing that people tend to miss, or don't necessarily recognise the importance of. And I think the other misunderstanding is that people don't necessarily understand the depth of CFT, that it is actually based on an evolutionary approach. And that evolutionary approach is based on understanding how motives are central in the process of organising our minds. And we can have multiple motives, so it gets quite complex. And the evolutionary and cultural nature of motives is important. So I think it's really kind of valuable for people to understand that it is not as straightforward as it might appear. It's not just a case of doing some of the compassionate exercises or the breathing or anything like that, but it's really making sense of the struggles that we have as human beings to make sense of our motives and our emotions. So, I suppose the bottom line would be that with CFT, we're really thinking about how do you cultivate the caring motivation, because that's really important, and it underpins a lot of our mental health and pro-social behaviour, is if we can really stimulate caring motivations as opposed to competitive motivations. So, if we can see that, then we can really make sense of how individuals and groups struggle with caring connections, because how they relate to themselves and each other really influences everything. So I suppose that's the one thing that I find, is that you can, at some levels, see, typically people will talk about the 3 circles, and they'll talk about, we have a drive system, and we have threat system, and we have a soothing system. And they'll talk about how we really boost the soothing system to look after the other 2. But there's a tendency to miss out the whole sort of understanding of the role of motives as well as emotions. So to make sense of that, I think is is important. And also, I suppose, the other thing that is important with CFT is it was developed originally, as we know, from a clinical need.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that it was developed because people were not recovering with the standard therapies, and the reason they weren't was because of shame and self-criticism was really impacting on people's ability to recover. So it didn't come from a kind of what can I say, a well-being, self-support model. It came from how can we help people that are really struggling with serious issues, as some of those that I talked about earlier on, with psychosis, with depression, anxiety, and saying, well, let's see what's stopping them from recovering. And what Paul found was it was generally shame and self-criticism that were stopping people, because if you're having a dreadful relationship with yourself, which is about saying that whatever you do isn't good enough according to you, regardless of what other people are saying, it's just not good enough to you. Living with that kind of mind is really hard. It's really difficult. So I don't think we should underestimate how painful that is to live with, and to sort of make sense of that and help people to recover from that position is really, what would I say? It's transformative. So I don't know whether that answered your question, but that's generally what I was thinking about when you talked about it, is that, to summarise, I suppose it's the complexity that sometimes gets missed, because we've got some lovely diagrams with lovely circles and things like that, and it makes it look quite straightforward. But it is a bit like an onion, so it's different layers that you understand over time, and that's both for people that we work with clinically as well as therapists that we work with in training.
And of course, as we know, it's not only about soothing.
No,
It's
it's yeah. So yeah, that's important. I think, as we know, it's not about let's soothe everything away and make it all beautiful and nice. It's about being able to tolerate and notice the shadow side of our existence that we all have, and understanding how we tolerate that and how we move beyond the dark side of our existence, like the emotions we'd rather not admit to, and the motives we'd rather not admit to. Because again, if we can do that, then we can reduce shame and self-criticism. If we recognise that that's part of human nature, that's still our responsibility. Yeah, we can't just blame it on our genes or our environment. So, well, it's not my fault. If I wasn't born to this, then I wouldn't have done it. It's about taking responsibility and saying, well, yeah, I recognise that what I'm experiencing and the way I'm relating is as a result of my upbringing, and some of the blind spots that occurred as a result of that.
So, as Paul would say, it is not your fault, but it is your responsibility.
Yeah.
So this whole mechanism, or self-soothing and self-regulating, is important, because only once I am, let's say, self-regulated, I can do something about it. I have the resilience. I'm brave enough to take appropriate actions.
Yeah. So yes, I think you're right. The notion of bravery or courage, as we would say with many of the practices, is noticing the courage that it takes to really engage with this, and notice that, it is quite difficult to do that at times. So yeah, on the surface level, it looks quite straightforward and kind of nice, let's just soothe everything away, and but actually to tolerate and have the courage to be with aspects of ourselves and with aspects of other people that are difficult without judging, without blaming, is the real challenge.
And any so one of my favorite questions I'm being often asked, Wendy. So I'll do it to you now.
Thank you.
But I'm sure you can answer the question. So any dangers when it comes to compassion? Because as we know, with the mindfulness practices, there are some dangers that we may encounter or difficulties. What about compassion? So I think, again, there are two things to it. So on the one hand, well, is it dangerous? Should certain people avoid the compassion-based practices? And then the other questions with the difficulties and challenges to do with that side of the practice.
Well, I think my experience to date has been that even though I've done this with groups, with teachers who have no, prior psychological knowledge, with children, I haven't noticed any major problems in terms of impact that's happened to them. However, that is probably as a result of the care that's taken in terms of managing anything that might occur. So, of course, there's always the possibility that people will be triggered by what you do. So, calming down, slowing down, for example, can be a trigger to, if that's your coping strategy, is to keep on speeding up to avoid looking at things, then, it's going to be uncomfortable when you're asked to slow down. And, can mean that you have a response to that, which is quite distressing. So I think really it's not so much to avoid doing any practices, but it's to really take care to think, well, what will I do if I suddenly feel uncomfortable? I notice something in my body or in my mind that's really difficult to be with. And so, we take great care in setting this up to say, this, whatever we do in our exercises, we always invite people to say, if this gets difficult, if it gets tricky, just take yourself out of it. Be kind to yourself. If compassion is being difficult for you, be kind to yourself. Notice it, talk to us. And that's the thing about connection. Is, if you can develop a safe haven, secure base with somebody, with a group, might not necessarily be the leader of the group or the therapist, it might be with someone else, then, find some way to talk to them, to think about how you might resolve the triggers that have happened. So, I had a personal experience of this when I was quite new to CFT. I'd had quite a lot of individual therapy at various points in my career because it was required and because I required it. So I made this rather arrogant assumption that I was, absolutely sorted. Well, not absolutely sorted, but sorted as any of us human beings could be. So I wasn't anticipating having any particular triggers. And so I went to one of Paul's talks, and I just found myself in tears at some point, which was quite unexpected. Now, I was fortunate in that, I did appreciate what might be going on. My only dilemma was, do I stay in the room or am I going to disturb everybody else because I'm crying? And what I noticed was I was able to bring my own compassionate voice to it and say, yep, that makes sense, Wendy. Maybe you just hadn't sorted that particular aspect. It was a kind of grief response. I was lucky because I did have that insight to be able to understand that. And it was my years of work and the CFT therapy itself that helped me to understand that and have that dialogue in my own mind in that moment. And then to move from that moment and think, what do I need to do about this? Do I need to do something further about it? Do I need to do some more therapy, or do I need to do some more work with myself on thinking about this grief response that I had? So I was able to, yes, it was painful, but I was able to be with it, to tolerate the distress, and to think about what I needed to do and go ahead and do that, which in my case was to do a bit more grief work. And, I think that's about, as you just said earlier on, it's saying it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility, And if I'm going to do the best I can for myself, to do to do the best I can for people and do no harm, if we break it down to the fundamentals, then, I can move forward with this. And that's my motivation, is to do the best I can for myself and for other people. And then that's quite empowering. Then there's somewhere to go with it. There's somewhere to be with it. You're not just stuck with a bunch of emotions that seem to be ruling your life rather than you ruling your emotions. So yes, I think that was the important thing really for me, is being able to, having the skill to notice these things. And like anything that you learn, it takes time to gain those skills, and to have a community around you that can support you. So and that's the work that we did in schools, really, is saying, usually there is someone there to be talked to. So there's a school counsellor, or there's the teachers that were also, part of the project, as well as the pupils themselves. That they found that they were talking to each other much more, for example, about problems that they were experiencing, and thinking about how they might help each other. So it's the connection, I suppose, that's important. And things that tend to get difficult are when there's that loss of connection, when there's no consideration of where to turn to and what to do once things are triggered. So I don't know whether that makes any sense, but
it does. I think it completely. Yeah. So if you don't mind telling us, since we've already started on that, telling us a few words about the compassionate mind training in schools, this project that you are now involved with, because it's both for teachers and the pupils. So if you don't mind, telling us how do you introduce compassion into schools?
Okay, well, I have to say I'm a kind of a small cog in this. So the main people that have set this up are Frankie Moratos, Professor Frankie Moratos from the University of Derby, and Marcela Matos from Portugal. So there's been a two-country study that have been looking at various aspects of developing compassion in schools. And that was also based on the work of Mary Welford, who also has done an awful lot of compassion in schools. So they're my major people that I turn to in terms of working with compassion in schools. So what we did was, firstly, we developed a sort of set piece of 6 sessions that we did, firstly with the teachers, to help them to understand what the model was about and how they might bring compassion to their world, because they're under increasing amounts of stress and experiencing a difficult time, both in the UK and in Portugal, And then the way we did that was go through some of the understanding, so the psychoeducation that we talk about in CFT. So helping them to understand the brain-body connection, helping them to understand how the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system work, and how we can influence those quite easily, quite quickly. So we take them through some of the compassionate mind training exercises in the group. And then we ask them to think about how they might relate that to their everyday life and life in school. And then having done that with the teachers, the outcomes were quite good as far as we can tell so far. They've really been made a big difference really to their understanding at a much deeper level than a kind of simple sort of physical, social intervention that doesn't necessarily explain the science behind it. So that was a big thing. And then the teachers that we work with, some of those teachers, we worked with their group, so their class, and the teachers stayed in the class with us and also were there to support the children. So we did year 6 children mainly, because year 6 were making a transition from primary to secondary school. So to help them to make the most of understanding that transition, we thought compassion might influence them. So we're hoping to do, I hope we can, find some research fund to do some follow-up studies to see whether that actually happened. But again, the outcome with the children was it did make a difference, and they did see an improvement in their well-being. So it wasn't about addressing particular symptoms or problems in schools. It was more of a preventative issue of saying, how can we increase your well-being as you transition from one stage of life to another. So, and then what we've done with that then is we're hoping that will be in the UK. It was a whole school study, so everyone came to the training. It wasn't just the teachers and the students. In some case it was the whole of the school, so whether it was the secretaries or cleaners or whoever. So we're looking at developing communities of compassion within schools, so that everybody knows what's going on and everybody feels included in that. We had a bit of a break because of COVID and everything, of course, so I hope that we'll continue the study in the future. So we've got a couple of papers that are just about ready for publication now, so they'll be coming out in the next few months or so. So it was very valuable, and I felt very privileged to be part of that study, because to me it was about sort of taking it to different communities and saying, how can we make a difference? I think one of Mary's workshop is wait till adulthood till you find out about these things. So maybe it will help us to be wise and courageous in the future if we begin with that perspective as at a younger age.
So what are the main obstacles in introducing compassion in your experience, Wendy?
In general, I would say the biggest problem is time and resources.
As simple as
sadly,
that.
Yeah, it is. Because, of course, and I found this in my own research as well, is that because we live in a world that's really focused on time being money, time being limited, then the struggle is to help people to slow down enough to be able to engage. Simple as that. So when we're working in schools, having to fit everything into, 5 or 6 sessions of, I think we were there for, I can't remember how long it was, an hour and 20 minutes, I think, something like that per session. And because we're all focused on outcome. Schools are focused on outcome, get pupils ready for taking exams. And depending on the outcome of those exams depends on the outcome for the schools. So this is the difficulty we have. We all have in saying, how do we find space and understand that actually if we did find space, maybe we'd make a big difference. I tend to be into phrases a lot, and I like little phrases that capture the imagination. And I'll always remember one that Dennis Church from the United States, he came to, I think he was presenting a symposium. And I'll always remember he started it off by saying, "We've got a lot to get through, so we'd better slow down." And,
Oh, that's lovely.
I thought just about summed it up. He's absolutely right. And that's the biggest hurdle, I think, to compassion is being able to slow down enough to take it into, to actually understand it, to make sense of it, means that you have to spend time. So yeah, and resources, of course, that go along with that is that we're more likely to engage in finding resources for other things. Threat-based responses, so tend to take up resources rather than proactive, which again is the product of our human nature. Really, is we're going to respond to threat before anything else. So that's absolutely understandable, but that's not always the wisest position to take.
And we're always in this achieving or fighting mode.
Yeah, we're always in that drive of, got to do more, quicker, more efficient. And then, that goes through that loop into self-criticism if we don't do that. If we don't achieve, then what does that say about us? What are the consequences? And we're going to focus on the threat because that's how our mind is built, to scan for threat. So it's a skill in itself in slowing down when your body and your mind is sometimes saying speed up. Not that I'm saying that there aren't times when you do need to speed up. Of course, you do. It's balancing the whole system, not just slowing down. It's also about using the drive system effectively and responding to threat appropriately.
So essentially, it would be about rebuilding, or maybe rebuilding, that's too much of a word, but changing, reshaping our societies. So compassion, or a more compassionate approach, let's say, would be included in our way of being, approaching our various tasks and activities.
Yeah, and it's about lots of different things. I mean, one of the other influences at the moment that I'm reflecting on is Darcia Navese's work. So she's just published a book called Restoring the Kinship Worldview, and thinking about how do we establish that kinship that we've lost along the way. And what would it take? So it's coming back to this more inclusive rather than an individual narrow view of resources, holding and controlling resources rather than caring and sharing resources, which is another thing that's fundamental to Paul's model, is how do we move from one to the other? How do we learn again to take care of each other and the world?
So my two last questions, actually, you answered one of these questions. So any books that you've recently read and inspired you? That's my first question,
Mhm.
Wendy. Any new reading
Well, yeah,
materials?
that's been the main one actually. Is Dacia Naves'
Mm,
book. That's really, I suppose, inspiring me. I haven't
mm,
read it all yet, but it's
mm,
inspiring me to think more widely about
mm,
things, and there is a sense of optimism
mm,
um, in that. Hopefully, a wise optimism, not a kind
mm,
of naive optimism. I think we do have the opportunity
mm,
to do this, and there is evidence of that all over the
mm,
world. Because of the work you're doing in Poland, the work
mm,
that is happening in the United States,
mm,
and the people that we have encountered across the world in Iceland, Sweden, Denmark,
mm,
Mexico, Argentina.
mm,
They're all working really hard at
mm,
thinking about how we can be more compassionate in the world.
mm,
Um, and what else? And I think, as I said earlier on, being able to think more um widely about how we research and how we make sense of therapy. So, as I said, the work that from Stefan Hoffman and
mm,
Stephen Hayes, I think,
mm,
was quite valuable. And that was a particular research article that was the future of intervention science,
mm,
process-based therapy. So that really got me thinking again
mm,
about how do we help people to do this? How
mm,
do we teach it? How do we teach it to other
mm,
therapists? How do we help them to
mm,
integrate a wider view of science and a wider view of what we're doing? So it's all about
mm,
expanding views, I
mm,
guess,
mm.
is where I'm at the moment.
So, how to live according to Wendy Wood would be your answer, Wendy?
Oh, wow. How to live. Okay, so I think how to live is expanding horizons, um, because the more we connect with people at
Mm,
all sorts of levels,
mm,
I believe that the healthier we are,
mm,
and the more healthy we can be, the more we can offer.
mm,
So, and I think there's even
mm.
evidence to support that. That I think I was reading the other day that the more people we connect with, the bigger our frontal lobe becomes.
Oh,
So,
that's very interesting. Mm.
so, so I think that's what we're doing. And of course, because we co-regulate as human
Mm,
beings,
yeah.
then the more you engage with
Mm,
others in a helpful,
mm,
compassionate way, the more you gain
mm,
yourself.
mm,
Oxytocin flows, dopamine flows, and
mm,
um, it all becomes a really valuable,
mm,
engaging world to be in,
mm,
without denying, I say the suffering that goes on. I'm not
mm,
trying to soothe away the
mm,
tragedy and the suffering that
mm,
goes on in this world.
mm,
But maybe if we can connect together
mm,
with minds that have a
mm,
genuine motive to make a difference, then
mm,
we can support people that are struggling and suffering needlessly.
mm, mm. So thank you so much, Wendy, Dr. Wendy Wood. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you and also our listeners, well, do have a good life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia.